My phone buzzed while I was standing in line at the gas station, and I almost dropped it because the notification wasn't from a person, it was from my bank. Balance under $40. Then another buzz right after, an email with the subject line, reference check result. And I already knew before opening it that it wasn't good. I just stood there staring at the pump number like it might change something. And when I finally read the email, it said they couldn't move forward because someone close to me had raised concerns about my honesty, which is when I realized my parents were still doing it, even after I left town. I didn't leave the gas station right away after that email. I stood there long enough that the guy behind me cleared his throat twice and the cashier leaned forward like she was deciding whether to ask if I was okay. I paid in cash because my card had started declining randomly and walked back to my car without looking at my phone again. I sat there with the door still open because the inside smelled like old receipts and spilled coffee, and I didn't want to close myself in yet. I kept rereading the line about concerns raised by someone close to me, and my brain kept trying to swap in different names even though I already knew. I drove back to my apartment instead of going home because I didn't trust myself not to turn the car around. When I got inside, I kicked my shoes off too hard and one of them hit the wall. I noticed the scuff later and still haven't cleaned it. My phone rang while I was filling a glass with tap water and I watched it vibrate across the counter, my mother's name flashing like it had been waiting. I let it stop, then she called again. So I answered and didn't say hello. She started talking about a recipe she tried and how the weather was supposed to change. Then she asked if I'd heard back from the job yet, and I said yes, just that. And there was a pause where I could hear her breathing. She said she might have mentioned a few things because she didn't want me getting hurt again. She said it like advice, like she was helping. My jaw tightened and my tongue felt thick, so I hung up without explaining. I stared at the phone afterward like it might ring back immediately, but it didn't. I grew up in a town called Briar Hollow, small enough that people recognize your car before they remember your name. I moved out 2 years ago after a fight that ended with my father standing in the doorway so I couldn't leave until he finished talking. I'd been working part-time before that, nothing fancy, just enough to keep my account from hitting zero. The first job I lost came out of nowhere. The manager wouldn't look at me and said it wasn't personal. After that, every interview felt the same. Smiles that stopped short, calls that never came. Once someone said they'd heard things. Another time, a manager asked if I'd ever had issues with theft. I remember nodding automatically even though the question didn't make sense. I stopped telling friends where I was applying because their faces changed when they said they'd put in a good word and then never mentioned it again. My parents always said they were worried about me, that I was impulsive, that people needed to know the truth. My father liked saying respect has to be taught. I started keeping screenshots of emails and rejection notices without really knowing why, just dragging them into a folder on my laptop labeled work. I didn't open that folder often, but I knew where it was. That night after the call, I sat on the floor and plugged my phone in because the battery was low and watched the screen light up without any new notifications. And if this is sounding familiar or you just want to know where it's going, you can like and subscribe. I won't pretend that doesn't help. The interview at Harlow Freight wasn't supposed to matter. That's what I kept telling myself while I drove there. Because the road out past Briar Hollow has long stretches where your phone loses signal and the radio clicks in and out. And I figured, if nothing else, it would be practice. The building looked newer than anything back home. Glass doors that didn't stick, a lobby that smelled like cleaning spray instead of dust. The HR woman asked me the usual things and typed while I talked, nodding without really reacting. I watched her pen instead of her face. The questions about gaps came up again, and I gave the same answers I always do, keeping them short so I didn't sound defensive. I was already rehearsing the drive back when the door opened and a man walked in without knocking. Mid-50s maybe, no tie, carrying a folder under his arm like he'd grabbed it on the way. The HR woman stood up so fast her chair rolled back, which is when I realized this wasn't part of the plan. He said my name carefully, first and last, like he was testing how it sounded out loud, then asked if I'd ever gone by another last name. I said no, and my hands slid into my lap because they were starting to shake. He didn't sit down right away, just looked at the folder, then at me, then said he needed to check something before they went any further. He placed the folder on the table and pushed it toward me, but didn't let go right away, like he was making sure it was the right one. My grandmother's name was written on the tab in faded ink, crooked the way her writing got near the end, and my throat went dry so suddenly I had to swallow twice before I could open it. The top page was a letter dated over a decade ago, with no greeting, just my name, and a sentence about not trusting my parents with anything important. Under that were copies of emails and statements, a voicemail transcript where my father's words were printed out in flat text. Tell them she steals. Seeing it like that made it feel heavier somehow. The man finally sat down and said my grandmother had invested in the company early, before they even had this building, and that she asked for one condition in return, that if anyone ever contacted them questioning my character, they were to pause and verify instead of passing it along. He said they'd gotten a call 2 days earlier, not from my parents directly, but from someone who knew them, raising concerns, and that triggered the folder. I kept flipping pages even after I'd seen enough, my fingers leaving smudges on the paper. There were statements from 2 former employers saying my parents had warned them, dates lining up with when I lost those jobs. The HR woman stopped typing at some point and just watched me. The man said they'd already confirmed everything with their legal team and that they were proceeding with the hire. But the words came to me slowly, like he was speaking through water. I nodded because that felt safer than talking, signed where they pointed, my signature slanted because the pen skipped. When I stood up, my legs felt strange, like they'd forgotten what they were supposed to do. I walked out of the building with the folder copied, but not the original. They kept that. And when I sat in my car, I noticed my hands were red where I'd been gripping the steering wheel without realizing it. If you're still here, yeah, like and subscribe. I'm almost done with the part where everything tilts. I started the job 2 weeks later. Nothing dramatic, just an email with onboarding times and a badge waiting at the front desk, the kind with my name printed too large. The legal part happened without me in the room, which I think was intentional, because all I saw were forwarded emails with subject lines that sounded boring. Notice of correction, formal retraction, documentation attached, and my grandmother's name copied in places where it felt strange to see it. The company's attorney sent letters to every place my parents had contacted, attaching transcripts and statements, asking for written confirmation that the false information would be removed from their records. Some replied quickly with apologies that felt stiff. Others didn't reply at all, which somehow said more. I deleted my parents' numbers from my phone one night while sitting on the floor eating cereal out of the box. I didn't announce it or tell anyone. I just watched the contact cards disappear and locked my screen. My mother showed up at my apartment once. My neighbor texted me because she recognized the car. I stayed inside and counted the seconds between knocks until they stopped. Later, I heard through someone else that my father had been called into a lawyer's office thinking it was about something minor. He laughed at first, then the recording played, the same sentence he used to repeat at home, flat and confident, printed out and read back to him. After that, the call stopped. At work, no one treated me like a cause or a favor. I filled out forms, learned shortcuts for software, ate lunch at my desk because I didn't know where people usually sat. My bank app stopped sending warnings after the first paycheck cleared, and that felt bigger than everything else. One afternoon, my niece asked why great-grandma saved papers instead of just giving me money, and I told her I didn't know, which wasn't a lie. I still don't. Going back to Briar Hollow now isn't hard, not because anyone says anything, they mostly don't, but because the streets feel slightly misaligned, like the map is right, but the scale is off. Sometimes I catch myself waiting for another email to drop everything again, even on good days, especially on good days. I keep the copied documents in a folder on my laptop I don't open, not because I'm afraid they'll disappear, but because I don't need to look at them anymore. The last thing I changed was my emergency contact at work. It took less than a minute. I stared at the blank field longer than that before typing. If you made it all the way here, you can like and subscribe if you want. I still flinch a little when my phone buzzes, but it's usually just a calendar reminder now.